In the chronicles of history, few rulers left a legacy as tainted with corruption as Tiberius Caesar Augustus, Rome's second emperor. His reign, which began with the discipline of a seasoned military commander, gradually descended into a nightmare of depravity that shocked even the most immoral of his time. The tales from his self-imposed exile on Capri paint such a grotesque picture that historians still question their truth. Yet, the consistency of ancient accounts, particularly those of Suetonius and Tacitus, suggests that behind the polished marble of imperial power lurked a darkness beyond comprehension. When Tiberius assumed power in 14 AD, Rome felt relief. He was a proven general, a leader who had secured the empire's frontiers and shown skill in administration. As the adopted son of Augustus, he appeared to be the ideal successor to uphold the Julio-Claudian dynasty. But beneath his stern, seemingly reluctant exterior, shadows were already forming. His early life had been scarred by tragedy: the death of his beloved brother Drusus, a forced divorce from his first wife Vipsania, and an unhappy political marriage to Julia, Augustus's notoriously scandalous daughter. These wounds festered within him, creating fractures in his character that would one day break wide open. The change was gradual. For the first decade, Tiberius ruled capably, continuing Augustus's policies, managing finances responsibly, avoiding reckless wars, and initially respecting the Senate's authority. Yet those close to him noticed a growing bitterness, a creeping cynicism that darkened over time. The death of his son Drusus in 23 AD, likely by poison, marked a turning point. Stricken with grief and suspicion, Tiberius withdrew from public life. The general who once marched through Germania now recoiled from the very people he governed. By 26 AD, he made the decision that forever tarnished his legacy. Abandoning Rome, he retreated to the island of Capri under the pretense of escaping the burdens of power. In truth, he was building a private realm where his darkest desires could reign unchecked. With its sheer cliffs and isolation, Capri became the perfect backdrop for horrors that even jaded Romans found unspeakable. 12 villas rose across the island, each an extravagant monument concealing whispered terrors among the servants. Though the Senate continued to meet in Rome, real authority now radiated from Capri. Tiberius ruled through letters steeped in fear. One missive might carry a death sentence, while silence alone could seal a man's fate. Those who visited Capri often returned broken, if they returned at all. The emperor surrounded himself with astrologers, most notably the ominous Thrasylus, who fed his paranoia with prophecies of betrayal. To Tiberius, every senator was a potential traitor, every hushed word a looming conspiracy. The empire was now under the rule of a recluse whose primary interactions with the outside world consisted of issuing execution orders. What distinguished Tiberius from other despotic leaders was not merely his brutality. It was the twisted imagination with which he sought his pleasures. Ancient accounts depict scenarios that push the limits of human depravity. The emperor's sexual desires had morphed into something grotesque, particularly fixating on the innocent and vulnerable. Children, both boys and girls, were brought to Capri under various false pretenses, never to leave unscathed. Some were trained as minnows, a term that still unsettles historians. They were instructed to swim between the emperor's legs in his pool, nibbling and caressing him in bizarre aquatic games. The activities by the pool were just the beginning. Suetonius, writing years later but with access to imperial records and first-hand accounts, recounts elaborate sexual theatrical performances. Young individuals were compelled to engage in sexual acts while Tiberius observed, often in groups of 3, which he referred to as chains. The emperor amassed erotic art and literature from throughout the empire, especially from the east, using them as guides for new forms of debauchery. His bedchambers were adorned with the most explicit imagery, fostering an environment of perpetual sexual arousal. Even the most jaded courtiers were taken aback by the emperor's innovations in perversion. Perhaps the most unsettling were the spintrier, young sex slaves meticulously trained in specific acts. These children, taken from their families or sold by desperate parents, were educated solely in the arts of pleasure. They resided in the villas of Capri, their entire lives dedicated to fulfilling the emperor's increasingly bizarre demands. Some were instructed to perform acts so peculiar and specific that Latin lacked the vocabulary to describe them. The term spintrier itself became so linked with unspeakable acts that it was seldom used in polite Roman society thereafter. These children had no prospects beyond Tiberius's whims. Many perished during their service, and those who survived were frequently killed to guarantee their silence. The corruption extended beyond Tiberius himself. To sustain his extravagant lifestyle, the emperor required accomplices, which he found among the ambitious and equally corrupt. Young nobles, eager for favor, would offer their own siblings or children to the emperor. Others took on the role of procurers, searching the empire for new victims to satisfy Tiberius's desires. An entire economy of exploitation emerged around the imperial court, with human flesh serving as its currency. Officials who hesitated or had moral reservations found themselves accused of treason, their assets seized, and their families devastated. In this manner, Tiberius established a system where involvement in his depravity became a means of survival. The accounts that surfaced from Capri became increasingly horrific with each retelling. There were stories of infants still nursing being sexually abused, and noble virgins compelled to relinquish their innocence in religious rituals twisted for the emperor's gratification. One particularly disturbing narrative recounts how Tiberius would have young victims hurled from the cliffs of Capri after he had finished with them, with soldiers positioned below to ensure none survived the plunge. Whether every detail is accurate is less significant than the reality that Romans believed their emperor capable of such atrocities. The very survival of these accounts reflects the climate of fear Tiberius cultivated. His depravity extended far beyond lust. It was matched by a cruelty that seeped into every corner of his reign. The emperor took perverse pleasure in psychological torment, often sparing the condemned only to have them executed days later. Parents were sometimes compelled to witness the deaths of their children, or, in even crueler cases, to play a role in the executions themselves. One senator, after losing his son, was forced to continue appearing at banquets and public ceremonies as if nothing had happened, smiling and conversing while grief consumed him. Tiberius dismissed such acts as tests of loyalty, but in reality he reveled in human suffering. The distinction between governance and sadism collapsed entirely under his rule. Treason trials became the primary weapon of his tyranny, where even a careless word, gesture, or glance could be twisted into an act of betrayal. Informers, the delators, flourished in this climate, enriching themselves with the confiscated estates of the accused. In practice, accusation alone meant death, as Tiberius rarely acquitted anyone once charges were brought. Torture was commonplace, carried out with ever more grotesque ingenuity. The emperor himself devised torments, including one where victims were forced to drink enormous amounts of wine before their genitals were bound with tight cords, leaving them in agonizing pain as their bladders filled. Meanwhile, the Senate, once the proud heart of the Republic, had become nothing more than a chamber of terrified flatterers. Senators vied with one another in proposing absurd honors for Tiberius, each striving to display greater servility than the last. They condemned colleagues on the weakest pretexts, knowing that any show of mercy might make them the next target. The Senate, once the proud body that had defied Hannibal, now trembled before the whims of a single madman. Some senators chose suicide over trial, knowing it was the only way their families might preserve property and honor. Even death itself provided no escape from Tiberius's wrath. He prosecuted the dead, seizing estates and erasing memorials. Children were executed for grieving too openly. The law became nothing more than a weapon of terror, with forgotten statutes dredged up and twisted to suit the emperor's paranoia. The charge of maestas, injury to the dignity of Rome, expanded to cover virtually anything. Men were executed for carrying coins stamped with Tiberius's likeness into brothels or latrines, for mocking a poem he had written in his youth, even for consulting astrologers about his health. Fear spread like poison through Roman society. Trust evaporated as friends, neighbors, and even family members became potential informers. Dinner parties grew silent, conversation replaced by nervous glances. Writers destroyed their own works rather than risk denunciation. The flourishing intellectual culture of Augustus's era withered in the suffocating air of suspicion. Parents even warned their children to watch their words while asleep, lest they mumble something treasonous in a dream. Rome itself was unraveling under the weight of fear. Meanwhile, Tiberius descended deeper into corruption and madness on Capri. Never handsome, his appearance had become grotesque. Ancient sources describe his face pocked with sores and scabs, the result of both disease and the ointments he smeared upon it. He wore wigs to conceal his baldness and thick makeup to mask his ruined features. The once great general now resembled a diseased satyr skulking in his island fortress. His paranoia reached extremes. He had condemned prisoners to taste his food before he ate and surrounded himself with guards even in his bedchamber. The running of the empire increasingly fell to Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect who enabled and magnified Tiberius's cruelty. For years Sejanus ruled in Rome with almost unchecked authority while the emperor remained secluded on Capri. But even this partnership ended in betrayal. In 31 AD, Tiberius suddenly turned on his minister, orchestrating Sejanus's downfall with the same inventive malice he showed his other victims. The purge that followed claimed hundreds of lives. Anyone connected to Sejanus was destroyed. Children were executed alongside their parents, in defiance of Roman tradition. In one of the most chilling episodes, a young girl was raped by her executioner before death, because virgins could not be legally put to death. In his final years, Tiberius's reign reached a crescendo of cruelty. Now in his 70s, his physical appetites had waned, but his sadism only grew sharper. Obsessed with death, he consulted astrologers constantly, then executed those who predicted his end. Yet he also seemed to court death, taking reckless risks and neglecting his health. The emperor who once commanded Rome's legions now ruled only through fear, his empire suffocated by his paranoia and bloodlust. After more than a decade in seclusion on Capri, Tiberius suddenly reappeared on the mainland, his brief journeys leaving devastation in their wake. These visits resembled the spread of plague rather than the progress of an emperor, as communities frantically hid their young and beautiful from his predatory gaze. Ancient historians competed to outdo one another in describing the depths of his corruption. Even if some details were exaggerated, the overall picture is disturbingly consistent. Tacitus, usually regarded as the most sober voice of the age, wrote with barely restrained revulsion, confessing he could hardly bring himself to record what he knew. And while Roman historians often painted hated emperors in the darkest colors, the sheer volume and uniformity of the accounts strongly suggest a reign of genuine horror. The puzzle that continues to haunt historians is how a man who began as a disciplined general and competent administrator could become such a monster. Some point to the corrosive effects of unchecked power, seeing in Tiberius an extreme embodiment of Lord Acton's dictum that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Others suspect mental illness, paranoia, alcoholism, or the cumulative stress of rule. His personal tragedies, too, his forced divorce, his loveless marriage, the death of his son, surely contributed to the disintegration of his mind. Yet perhaps the most unsettling explanation is also the simplest, that the cruelty had always been there, waiting for the opportunity to emerge. Modern psychology might label him with sadistic personality disorder, paranoid schizophrenia, or sexual sadism. But such terms seem inadequate. They fail to capture the horror of a man with limitless power and no restraint, who indulged his darkest impulses without consequence. Tiberius stands as a case study in what happens when civilization's boundaries are stripped away from someone already inclined toward evil. The Roman people themselves sensed this corruption. Rumors spread like wildfire across the empire, each tale more grotesque than the last. Parents invoked Tiberius as a boogeyman to frighten disobedient children. Graffiti cursing his name appeared on walls despite the deadly risk of discovery. Even among the aristocracy who profited under the imperial system, unease grew, a recognition that something fundamental had broken at Rome's core. Outwardly, the empire still functioned. Taxes were collected, borders defended, trade conducted. But beneath the surface, a moral rot had set in. Religion gave the nightmare yet another dimension. Romans believed the gods took a personal interest in human affairs, and many saw natural disasters during Tiberius's reign, earthquakes, floods, fires, as signs of divine anger. His desecration of sacred rites for sexual perversions was regarded as blasphemy of the highest order. Mystery cults that had flourished under Augustus slipped underground, fearing they too would be twisted to serve imperial lust. In Tiberius's reign, Rome witnessed not merely tyranny, but the collapse of the very moral order upon which the empire had been built. The very spiritual core of Rome was being corroded by its emperor. Though often overlooked, the economic consequences of Tiberius's reign of terror were severe. The constant confiscation of property enriched the imperial treasury but crushed the entrepreneurial energy that had fueled Roman prosperity. Wealthy families concealed their fortunes or squandered them quickly to avoid suspicion. Investments stalled, as success itself became dangerous. Informers, the delators, spawned a parasitic economy built on destruction rather than production. Even on Capri, the upkeep of Tiberius's pleasures, the sprawling villas, the armed guards, the endless supply of victims, devoured resources that might have strengthened the empire. Foreign affairs fared little better. Ambassadors languished for years, uncertain whether approaching the emperor would bring reward or death. Allied kings found their children detained in Rome, thinly disguised hostages meant to guarantee loyalty. Rome's eastern rival, Parthia, watched in astonishment as the empire turned inward, consumed by purges and perversions. On the frontiers, provincial governors, too busy preserving their own lives, let territories slip from imperial control. The discipline that had once forged Rome's empire was rusting away from within. The cultural sphere reflected this decay. Poets fell silent or confined themselves to harmless mythological subjects. Historians retreated to the safety of remote antiquity rather than risk commenting on current events. In the visual arts, works became either crudely pornographic, pandering to imperial tastes, or sterilely conventional, crafted to avoid offense. The creative brilliance that had flourished under Augustus had withered under the shadow of fear. Even architecture betrayed the shift. Where Augustus had raised temples and public works, Tiberius erected only pleasure palaces on Capri and grim torture chambers in Rome. Women bore a uniquely tragic burden in this climate. Beyond the countless nameless victims of his lust, noble families were forced into impossible choices. Mothers surrendered daughters to the emperor to preserve their households. Wives of condemned men were executed or enslaved, children scattered like spoils. The few women who survived, such as Antonia Minor, did so only through extraordinary caution and likely painful compromise. Rome's ancient reverence for matrons and the sanctity of marriage collapsed before imperial appetite. Science and medicine, which had advanced in the early empire, also stagnated. Physicians busied themselves with aphrodisiacs and potions for the emperor's ailments rather than genuine innovation. His obsession with astrology elevated superstition over astronomy, while natural philosophers avoided inquiry altogether for fear that curiosity might appear subversive. The rational spirit Rome had inherited from Greece gave way to silence, fear, and mysticism. Even the military, long the backbone of Roman identity, was not spared the corruption. Military honor, once the pride of Rome, was steadily corrupted. Officers rose in rank not through valor but through their willingness to procure victims for the emperor or betray their comrades. The Praetorian Guard, originally established to shield the emperor, was transformed into an instrument of terror against Roman citizens themselves. Soldiers who had once dreamed of frontier glory found themselves ordered to hurl children from cliffs or torture senators at the emperor's command. The border legions remained effective out of habit and tradition, but the warrior spirit that had conquered the Mediterranean was fading into memory. Even Rome's justice, once a model admired across the world, became a grotesque parody of itself. Laws were twisted to serve only the emperor's desires. Legal precedent meant nothing when it clashed with his will. Advocates who defended the accused too boldly often found themselves standing trial soon after. Judges vied to convict, eager to prove loyalty through severity. The noble principles that would one day inspire Western law had been hollowed out, turned into weapons of oppression. As Tiberius aged, his paranoia deepened into obsession. He set tasters to watch over other tasters, guards to watch over guards. The astrologer Thrasylus never left his side, divining omens from bird flight or cloud formation to reassure the emperor of his fate. Yet in the end, death came not from daggers or plots but from nature, or, as some whispered, from the subtle hand of his successor. On March 16, AD 37, the emperor who had lived in constant dread of assassination met death alone, abandoned even by his vices. The reaction in Rome revealed the depth of loathing he had inspired. When news spread, the people poured into the streets in jubilation, shouting, "To the Tiber with Tiberius!" and demanding his corpse be cast into the river like that of a common criminal. The Senate, at last unshackled from fear, initially refused to deify him as they had Augustus. Only Caligula's intervention ensured he received the honors due an emperor, yet even these rites were perfunctory, devoid of genuine grief. Debate over Tiberius's legacy has never ceased. Some revisionist historians contend that Tacitus, Suetonius, and others exaggerated his crimes, motivated by political bias or the conventions of vilifying hated rulers. They point out that the empire's machinery of state continued to function, taxes collected, armies supplied, borders secured, suggesting a degree of stability beneath the scandal. Such arguments hold some weight. The ancient writers likely embellished. Yet the sheer consistency of their testimony, coupled with the palpable fear in contemporary documents, suggests that even if the most lurid details were magnified, the core truth remains. Tiberius's reign was one of genuine terror. Its psychological scars outlasted the man himself. Rome had learned that the emperor, once envisioned as the guarantor of order, could become a monster. The principate established by Augustus was revealed as a system capable not only of producing flawed rulers, but of unleashing rulers actively evil. That knowledge poisoned the bond between ruler and ruled for generations to come. Every future emperor would be shadowed by suspicion, his every act measured against the dark precedent of Tiberius. The Senate never regained its dignity or independence. It had been broken too thoroughly, and the precedents set in those dark years, the treason trials, the rise of informers, the blurring of private vice with public policy, would be revived by later emperors whenever tyranny returned. For Tiberius's countless victims, there was no posthumous justice. The children abused on Capri, the senators tortured in Rome, the families destroyed by false accusations. Their stories were never recorded, their voices lost to history, remembered only as statistics in the chronicles of oppression. We know thousands perished in his reign of terror, yet each number hides a human life cut short by imperial madness. The spintree, those young victims forced into debauchery, simply vanished from history, their ultimate fate unspoken but all too easily imagined. The moral wound inflicted on Roman society lingered for generations, perhaps never fully healed. Even the physical remnants of Tiberius's reign carried a sense of corruption. His villas on Capri stood abandoned for years, shunned as cursed ground. Later emperors visited the island briefly, but none dared stay long, as if the very stones were haunted by what had taken place there. The torture chambers of Rome were eventually dismantled, yet their sites remained infamous. Archaeological digs on Capri reveal traces of his vast building projects, but, mercifully, no direct evidence of the horrors described by ancient writers. Perhaps some truths are best left buried. Modern tyrants have often been compared to Tiberius, yet few match his particular fusion of political authority and personal depravity. The dictators of the 20th century unleashed mass terror, but their private vices remained separate from state policy. Tiberius was different. He made the gratification of his perversions a function of government itself. In this, he stands almost alone in history, a chilling warning of how far humanity can sink when absolute power erases every restraint. Why, then, did Romans endure such a monster for 23 years? The answer lies partly in fear. Resistance was certain death, and terror was relentless. But precedent also shackled them. The Principate, accepted under Augustus as a safeguard after decades of civil war, had delivered peace and stability. Once freedom was traded for security, Reversing that bargain became nearly impossible. The Senate had willingly surrendered much of its power, reclaiming it would have required a courage long since crushed by intimidation. Sporadic acts of defiance did occur, but they never coalesced into organized resistance. Cultural factors played their part as well. Beneath Rome's veneer of civilization lay deep currents of brutality, gladiatorial blood sport, slavery, the casual exposure of unwanted infants. These practices had always been tolerated as part of Roman life. Tiberius's excesses were extreme, but they existed on a continuum with what society already accepted. That continuity made it easier for many to rationalize, to convince themselves his behavior was simply a grotesque extension of the familiar rather than a monstrous aberration. And then there were the enablers, the courtiers, generals, and senators who fed his paranoia, abetted his cruelties, and offered their own daughters to preserve their fortunes. Their complicity ensured that Tiberius's madness was not just personal but systemic. The emperor may have been the architect of terror, but it was his willing collaborators who ensured its survival. Tiberius could never have sustained his reign of terror alone. He required procurers to supply victims, guards to enforce his will, informers to stoke his paranoia, and courtiers to normalize his depravity. Each of these people made a choice: to participate in evil for survival or, more often, for profit. Some may have justified their complicity by claiming refusal meant death. Yet many thrived in the system, building careers from the misery of innocence. These secondary monsters largely escaped retribution after Tiberius's death, slipping quietly back into Roman society with fortunes stained by blood. The consequences of his rule rippled far beyond Rome. Allied kingdoms looked on in horror as the supposed leader of the civilized world sank into corruption. Barbarian tribes, once overawed by Roman discipline and culture, began to question whether Rome represented a higher civilization at all, or merely brutality on an imperial scale. The moral authority that Rome had long claimed as the guardian of order was badly undermined. Stories of Capri traveled across borders, seeding doubt among peoples who would later resist Roman expansion. Religion and philosophy also shifted under the weight of his tyranny. Stoicism, with its emphasis on cultivating inner virtue regardless of external tyranny, gained new appeal. Eastern mystery religions promising salvation in the afterlife attracted those who had lost faith in justice on earth. In this way, the spiritual vacuum left by Tiberius's horrors helped prepare the ground for transformative new movements, one of which, Christianity, would eventually reshape the empire itself. The literary legacy of his reign lies less in what was written than in what was not. The silence of contemporary voices speaks volumes. For decades, writers dared not record the truth. By the time historians felt safe to write, they relied on fragments, secret memoirs, whispered recollections, official records that had slipped through the purges. The gaps are chilling. How many lives vanished unrecorded? How many stories were too grotesque even for Roman chroniclers to tell? The silence itself stands as a kind of testimony, an absence that confirms the scale of the horror. For us today, the story of Tiberius endures not merely as ancient scandal but as warning. It shows how swiftly a society that prides itself on law and culture can collapse into barbarism when restraints on power are stripped away. It shows how fear can paralyze good people into complicity. It shows how tyranny perpetuates itself by corrupting everyone it touches. And most disturbingly, it reminds us that the capacity for such evil does not belong to some alien class of monsters, but to humanity itself, waiting for conditions that allow it to flourish. The death of Tiberius brought immediate relief, but no lasting resolution. For even as Rome celebrated his passing, his successor Caligula would soon prove that imperial madness was not confined to one man. The structural flaws that had enabled Tiberius to twist the Principate into a machinery of terror remained unresolved. Rome had built a system in which the character of one man determined the fate of millions. Such a system would inevitably produce not only capable rulers but also monsters. The only faint consolation was that few tyrants who followed combined Tiberius's administrative competence with his personal depravity. Archaeology provides little to confirm or refute the darkest accounts. The villas on Capri reveal luxury and excess, yet nothing that definitively proves the horrors described. This absence of evidence has encouraged skeptics to suggest exaggeration. But absence of evidence is not proof of innocence. Tiberius possessed both the means and the motive to erase physical traces of his crimes. Victims hurled from cliffs left no bones to be uncovered. Medical and psychological theories continue to circle around his reign. Some suggest his facial disfigurement and skin ailments may have stemmed from venereal disease, creating a vicious cycle in which physical decay fed psychological deterioration. Others point to possible lead poisoning from Roman water systems and wine vessels as a factor in his instability. Such theories may explain elements of his decline, but they cannot account for the cold, systematic cruelty with which he wielded power. His depravity was not a symptom alone, it was a choice. Economic historians note a striking paradox. Despite the climate of terror, the Roman economy functioned with surprising stability. Trade routes remained open, taxes were collected, infrastructure maintained. This unsettling continuity demonstrates how vast systems can carry on even under monstrous leadership. It also raises darker questions. How many merchants, tax collectors, and bureaucrats chose to look away, continuing their routines while atrocities unfolded in plain sight? The gendered dimensions of Tiberius's crimes stand out with particular horror. Though he victimized both sexes, women and children were especially vulnerable in Roman society, their legal protections weak and their social standing no defense against an emperor above all law. Accounts of mothers forced to witness the violation of their children, of virgin priestesses desecrated, of noble women reduced to concubines, form a chilling thread that runs through every version of his reign. Comparative history offers few true parallels. Many rulers were cruel. Many were debauched. But rare is the figure who fused the two so completely. Nero's infamies were spectacular but theatrical, his sadism inconsistent. Caligula's perversions were wild but lacked the icy calculation of his predecessor. Tiberius, by contrast, occupies a unique niche in the gallery of historical monsters, the capable administrator who bent the machinery of empire into a tool for personal depravity, elevating private vice into public policy on an imperial scale. The propaganda value of Tiberius's reign of terror should not be underestimated. By comparison with his monstrosity, even mediocre successors could appear benevolent. The Senate and people of Rome had been so brutalized that they would accept almost anything short of active persecution. This lowering of expectations, paradoxically, helped stabilize the imperial system. After enduring the worst, Romans were content with neglect rather than demanding true good governance. In a dark irony, Tiberius had rendered a service to future emperors by setting the standard for tyranny so grotesquely high. The philosophical legacy of his reign troubled Roman thinkers for generations. If the gods were just, how could such evil prosper unpunished for so long? If virtue was rewarded and vice punished, why did the innocent suffer while the guilty thrived? These questions undermined the foundations of Roman religion and ethics, fueling a spiritual crisis that opened the way for new faiths. In Tiberius, the problem of evil had found its most terrifying embodiment, confronting Roman society with doubts it could not easily resolve. For those who lived through his rule, the psychological scars were lifelong. Senators who had condemned friends to save themselves carried guilt that no rationalization could ease. Parents who had failed to protect their children bore memories too heavy to speak aloud. Even those who remained silent lived under the burden of complicity. An entire generation was marked by what it had endured, what it had witnessed, or what it had failed to prevent. These damaged psyches shaped Roman society long after Tiberius's death. The artistic record of Tiberius reflects this dissonance. Early portraits in marble and on coinage depict a stern but dignified ruler. Later images, when they appear at all, show increasingly idealized features, as though art sought to mask reality. The contrast between these official representations and the accounts of ancient historians creates a disturbing duality, the face of Roman authority presented in stone, while texts describe a predator. This tension itself speaks to the heart of his reign, the maintenance of imperial dignity while committing unspeakable depravity. Modern Capri adds another layer to the story. The island's beauty draws millions of visitors, yet few guides linger on its darkest associations. The imperial villas are treated as archaeological curiosities, not crime scenes. Such sanitization is understandable, but it risks erasing memory. Every breathtaking cliffside view is also a place from which victims may have been hurled. The island's splendor remains forever shadowed by its history. Perhaps most enduring of all was the legal legacy Tiberius left behind. By expanding the treason laws to cover any act or word, he created a blueprint for judicial oppression. Torture as routine procedure, the execution of children, the punishment of families for a single man's crime, all became normalized in Roman practice. Even well-intentioned emperors struggled to roll back these precedents once they had been embedded. The corruption of justice proved far harder to erase than the death of the corrupter. Educational practices in Rome shifted dramatically under Tiberius. Where young nobles had once been trained in rhetoric, philosophy, and the duties of civic life, parents now instructed their children in the arts of survival. They learned how to flatter without appearing servile, how to read the subtle signs of imperial displeasure, and above all, how to remain unnoticed. The traditional Roman emphasis on virtue and public service became dangerous, even suicidal, in a world where integrity marked one as a threat and civic duty might require complicity in judicial murder. A generation grew up hiding its thoughts, trusting no one, and valuing silence over eloquence. The international slave trade also assumed new dimensions during Tiberius's reign. Beyond the usual traffic in laborers and household servants, a specialized market emerged for young and attractive slaves destined for Capri. Merchants across the empire adapted their inventories to suit imperial tastes, while pirates and kidnappers supplied the demand with human plunder. In this way, the emperor's personal vices shaped an entire sector of Roman economics. The same trade routes that brought silk and spices from the east now carried children to their doom. The commercialization of sexual slavery for the ruler's pleasure remains one of the darkest chapters in the empire's economic history. Environmental historians have remarked on the bitter irony of Capri itself. The island, celebrated for its sheer cliffs, azure waters, and fragrant gardens, became synonymous with human depravity. Tiberius's villas were architectural marvels, their ruins still impressive to modern visitors. Yet these palaces of luxury doubled as chambers of horror. The juxtaposition of paradise and perversion reminds us that evil often hides behind beauty, making its corruption all the more profound. Astrology, too, played a sinister role in sustaining the emperor's paranoia. Thrasylus and other court astrologers cloaked fear in the authority of the stars, granting cosmic sanction to brutality. Senators were executed because of planetary conjunctions. Children were abused on astrologically significant dates. This fusion of superstition and absolute power created a particularly toxic brew, one in which the heavens themselves seemed to conspire with cruelty. The medical profession was not spared from corruption. Physicians were summoned to prolong the suffering of torture victims, to tend to the emperor's diseased body while knowing what it inflicted on the innocent, and even to examine children for his pleasure. Some doctors resisted and paid the price, while others rationalized their collaboration as a lesser evil, preserving life to prevent worse. Yet their role left lasting ethical stains. Tiberius's reign thus raises questions still relevant today. What obligations do professionals bear when the structures of power demand complicity in evil? The demographic toll of these years is difficult to measure but profound. Beyond the countless executions and abuses, entire families were extinguished. Bloodlines that had endured for centuries vanished, their heirs cut down before they could reproduce. The Roman nobility, already a small and fragile elite, was particularly devastated. Every number in the ancient sources conceals a human tragedy, every statistic a severed branch in the great tree of Rome. The genetic and cultural loss inflicted on Rome under Tiberius was incalculable. Some historians argue that the degradation of the Roman elite during his reign helped pave the way for the empire's eventual decline by crippling the very class that had traditionally supplied leadership. Literary criticism of works from this period reveals the pervasive impact of censorship and fear. Writers developed elaborate codes and allegories to mask dangerous ideas. Historical parallels were drawn so subtly that only the initiated could decipher their meaning. This enforced subtlety enriched Latin literature in some ways, as authors became masters of implication and indirection, but much was lost. How many manuscripts were destroyed by their own authors out of terror? How many thoughts were never committed to writing at all? The silence in the record speaks as loudly as the words that survive. Architecturally, Tiberius left behind his Capri villas, engineering marvels perched on forbidding cliffs, constructed with immense resources and skill. Yet their technical brilliance stands in stark contrast to the moral degradation they housed. Roman engineering, capable of aqueducts that brought water to millions, was here perverted to build palaces of systematic abuse. This juxtaposition of genius and depravity, technical brilliance serving moral blindness, reaches its apex in Tiberius's constructions. For ethicists, Tiberius presents a rare, almost pure, case study in evil. Unlike rulers who justified atrocities in the name of ideology, conquest, or faith, his cruelty was personal. He killed and tortured not for Rome's glory, but for pleasure. This simplifies moral evaluation. There are no competing goods to weigh, yet also disturbs more deeply, for it forces us to confront evil that exists for its own sake, reveling in suffering without even the pretense of higher purpose. Survival strategies developed under his reign became cultural knowledge, passed down like a dark inheritance. Romans learned how to speak without saying anything, how to show enthusiasm without committing, how to survive by hiding thought and masking emotion. The damage to social trust was immense and lasting. Even after Tiberius's death, suspicion lingered. The open, argumentative culture of the Republic had given way to a society of survivors. Religious responses varied. Some Romans lost faith entirely, unable to reconcile divine justice with imperial impunity. Others turned to mystery cults that promised cosmic justice in the afterlife. Still others reimagined theology to include evil as part of a divine plan. In this spiritual vacuum, movements like Christianity found fertile ground. Its promise of ultimate justice and its uncompromising condemnation of the very evils Tiberius embodied offered an alternative to despair. Economically, the terror apparatus carried hidden but enormous costs. Beyond the villas and the Praetorian Guard, there were informers to pay, victims to procure, silences to buy, and corruption spreading through every level of administration. Rome was wealthy enough to absorb the waste, but the opportunity cost, what might have been built had resources not been consumed by paranoia and perversion, remains staggering. For military historians, Tiberius is a paradox. The same man who had been a brilliant general became a paranoid recluse who weakened the army he once led. His reign saw little expansion and quiet losses at the frontiers as attention turned inward. The discipline and strategic brilliance that had once served him in battle curdled into cruel calculation when applied to civilian rule. The role of alcohol and substances remains debated. Ancient sources emphasize his heavy drinking, particularly in later years. Some suggest that chronic alcoholism accelerated his physical decline and moral collapse. Others argue it was merely a symptom, a way of numbing what little conscience he retained. Either way, alcohol stripped away restraint, leaving his worst impulses unbridled. Sexual violence as state policy reached its nadir under Tiberius. Rape, once a weapon of war, became institutionalized in peacetime as a function of governance. A bureaucracy was created to procure and manage victims, normalizing the abuse of children at the very center of imperial power. This was something new. Previous conquerors had used sexual violence as a tool of domination. Tiberius made it a lifestyle. The geographical reach of these crimes reveals how thoroughly corruption penetrated the empire. While most documented atrocities occurred in Rome and Capri, the network supplying victims stretched across provinces. Governors identified and dispatched potential prey. Merchant ships carried human cargo alongside silk and spices. Evil at the center infected the peripheries, demonstrating how absolute power pollutes an entire system. Comparative history shows both parallels and uniqueness. The mechanisms of show trials, informers, and arbitrary executions appear in many tyrannies, but the fusion of political terror with sexual predation on such a scale is rare. Most dictators kept their private vices apart from their public crimes. Tiberius's innovation was to merge the two, turning his perversions into state policy. Perhaps most disturbing is the psychological profile of those who flourished under him. The courtiers who mastered flattery, the informers who built fortunes, the procurers who trafficked in human misery, all thrived in an atmosphere of fear and complicity. Their success reminds us that evil is never enacted by one man alone. It requires a system, and that system requires willing participants. Who were the people who thrived under Tiberius? Ancient sources provide names and glimpses, men of keen intelligence but complete moral emptiness. They mastered the rules of terror, building careers on the suffering of others. These secondary monsters often outlived their master, carrying their toxic skills into later reigns, proving that cruelty, once rewarded, has a long half-life. For legal historians, Tiberius's reign marks a turning point in the story of Western law. The blatant perversion of procedure into a tool of tyranny exposed the need for structural safeguards against arbitrary power. Later Roman jurists would attempt to define principles that bound rulers as well as subjects, that valued process as much as outcome, that insisted justice could not be reduced to the emperor's whim. These ideas were sharpened in the negative by seeing what happened when law served cruelty rather than restraint. The final assessment of Tiberius must hold together two truths: the horror of evil and its banality. Between atrocities, the empire carried on. Farmers planted, merchants traded, soldiers drilled. Normal life unfolded in the shadow of monstrosity. This coexistence of routine and nightmare is its own kind of terror. On Capri, victims may have heard fishermen singing in the coves below, the beauty of everyday life brushing against their screams. And so we are left with questions that outlive the man himself. How does a human being become capable of such evil? What systems amplify depravity rather than restrain it? Why do ordinary people so often choose compliance over resistance? These are not curiosities for historians alone, but warnings for every generation. Tiberius died on March 16, 37 AD, at the age of 77. Some say Macro, the new Praetorian prefect, smothered him. Others record a natural death. What matters is that he died unrepentant, still plotting executions from his sickbed, still suspicious of everyone around him. He left the empire morally poisoned, politically traumatized, spiritually wounded. When the Roman crowd shouted, "To the Tiber with Tiberius," they were not only cursing a dead tyrant, they were trying to wash away 23 years of terror. But some stains are too deep for any river to cleanse. Rome endured, but never forgot. Every future tyrant was measured against the standard of depravity set on Capri. The Principate, once Augustus's solution to civil war, had revealed its potential to birth monsters worse than war itself. Perhaps Tiberius's greatest crime was the poisoning of hope, showing Rome that civilization could go backward, that law could be bent into an instrument of sadism, that progress was not guaranteed. Yet even here, there are faint glimmers of resilience. Tiberius died. His evil was not immortal. Rome survived. Later emperors proved that dignity and competence were still possible. Writers like Tacitus and Suetonius preserved the truth, ensuring that victims would not be erased, that the crimes would be remembered. In the act of recording, they resisted. The lessons remain urgent. Power must be checked. Law must bind rulers as well as subjects. The vulnerable must be protected from the strong. Civilization rests on fragile foundations that crack when fear, greed, and cruelty go unopposed. Tiberius is long gone, but the conditions that created him, concentrated power, eroded accountability, normalized cruelty, remain threats in every age. His reign is history's starkest warning of what emerges when power strips away restraint. He demonstrates that depravity has no natural limits once conscience is silenced. But he also proves that evil, however strong, is not invincible. He died despised and alone. His name cursed. His memory reviled. The empire he defiled outlasted him by centuries. The human spirit he tried to crush endured. In that tension, between human depravity and human resilience, lies both the horror and the hope of history. And as you rest now, carried on the calm flow of the past, you might allow yourself to drift into sleep, knowing that even the strangest reigns eventually give way to quiet. Thank you for sharing this journey through history. When you wake again, more stories await, gentle voices from the past, ready to carry you once more into another time.